Welcome to this author's interview series. My name is Christina Theodoraki. I'm editor of Small Business Economics and Entrepreneurship Journal, and I have the great honor to interview today Simon Parker from Western University in Canada and University of Aberdeen. Welcome, Simon, and I would like to thank you for accepting to share your knowledge with us today and accepting to participate to this very, very special interview.
It's a pleasure.
So Simon is going to give us more insights of a special paper we published in Small Business Economics entitled Remembering David Storey, a Pioneer in Entrepreneurship Field, that was published only last December 2023. This very special paper has a group of very important authors in entrepreneurship literature and scholarly discussion, starting from Thomas Åstebro from HEC Paris, David Audretsch from Indiana University in Bloomington, Robert Blackburn from University of Liverpool, Andrew Burke from Trinity College in Dublin, Alex Coad from Waseda Business School, Mark Cowling from Oxford Brookes University, Davidsson from Queensland University of Technology and also Young Chopping International Business School, Michael Fritsch from Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, Francis Greene from University of Edinburgh, Paul Reynolds from Aston Business School, and finally Roy Thurik from Montpellier Business School and Erasmus School of Economics. So we see great authors came together to write a very special and important paper. But I would like to start my first question to you, Simon. Could you please tell us who is David Storey?
Yes, absolutely. David was, and I have to use the past tense here because sadly, we knew he was terminally ill when we started thinking about this article for him. And our intention was that it would be published while he was still alive. Unfortunately, the cancer got him before we could finish the article, so it turned into a tribute article. And so David sadly died last summer in 2023 before we had a chance to finish this tribute article. And David, it's fair to say, was a giant of the field, and his influence was enormous. And I hope in this interview I can give listeners some idea of some of the impact he had. The first thing I'd say about his influence is to put him in historical context. So we have to take our minds back a bit to the late 20th century when David really emerged as a scholar in what was then called small business economics. Actually, it was the study of a part of industrial economics, as it was then called, which looked at the small business sector within it and was often quite practical. It was quite practically oriented, but there were academics from a variety of fields: geography, economics, from sociology, from a variety of different areas, who were really studying this particular niche of business activity. And the emphasis, I think it's fair to say, was on established small businesses. There wasn't a huge amount of interest. There was some, but not a huge amount of interest in asking where did these firms come from. And that's really what became increasingly important in what emerged as the entrepreneurship field in the 1980s and 1990s, where it really took off. And straddling these two worlds was a small group of highly influential academics, among whom was David Storey. And David really crystallized this transition, this bridge between the two worlds, the two fields, in his well-known book called Understanding the Small Business Sector, which was published by Routledge in 1994, and which to date has gathered nearly 9,000 Google Scholar citations alone. And it's hard to understate the importance and impact of this book. In fact, the person who perhaps gives the best account of the impact it had on him is Davidsson, who refers to it directly in his part of the tribute article that SBE's just published about him. From my point of view, it was a hugely impactful piece of work too, because it really helped organize the field and bring together a sense of what we knew at that time about what was going on in the small business sector and what we needed to know about the emergence of these crucial firms. And let me say straight away, without any further delay, that people often underestimate and write off the small business sector. And it's really a big mistake to do that. Even if, as entrepreneurship scholars, we're more interested in emergence and innovation and growth and so on, the fairly, I don't want to use the word mundane, but the everyday quotidian small business makes up about half our economy in terms of employment, in terms of output, in terms of economic activity. They're incredibly important. And although these businesses are individually quite small, collectively they amount to a very large part of our economy. And so it was really an essential piece of work to bring together all of the disparate work that had been done in different areas. As I said, it had a multidisciplinary origin in terms of the people writing about small businesses were coming from all sorts of different areas. So it was invaluable to have it all brought together for the first time. And that certainly influenced my work and my thinking about my own contribution to entrepreneurship, which is the economics of entrepreneurship, which has tried to do a similar thing, but with more of a focus on entrepreneurship than on small businesses. But let me just say a little bit more about David, though. I've mentioned where he stood, how he helped unify and bring together this disparate, scattered literature on small businesses, and in his book, Understanding the Small Business Sector. But to give you a better idea of his coverage, I think a lot of people would remember him today for his work on small businesses, entrepreneurship, and public policy. And this had both an academic and a practical impact. So lots of work that came out in academic journals reflecting on what we know about policy impacts on small firms and entrepreneurs. And also, I would say, a huge impact on how practice is done and how recommendations are conveyed to policymakers who are interested in stimulating entrepreneurship. And again, a historical perspective might help a little here. Back in the 1980s, there was an explosion of interest among policymakers in entrepreneurship. They saw, with the Thatcher-Reagan revolutions, they saw the role of entrepreneurs as being essential for reinvigorating and bringing greater dynamism into Western economies. And so there was a lot of interest in what sort of policies could help entice people to become entrepreneurs and help them succeed in creating wealth, in innovating, and in creating jobs as well. And David was really at the heart of this change and was one of the more influential academics who were involved in the ongoing OECD publications and consultations with national governments. Together with Stevenson and Lundstrom, Storey was really a major figure there. And even today, the OECD continues to do country-level reports which go in depth about the SME and entrepreneurship policies within particular OECD countries and draws on a lot of work, including work David pioneered, to advise governments to improve and take best practices from elsewhere and instill them into their own policy set. And in fact, you can go online. I've been involved in a couple of these myself, one for Canada, one for Italy. And you can go online and you can read the kinds of practical reports and practical recommendations that OECD makes. So David was a big part of that. Just to conclude your question, Christina, my response to your question, let me just wrap up and say a little bit about David himself as a person and his philosophy, I suppose, about entrepreneurship research. David had a major focus on and an interest in researching in ways that would be practically useful. So he had little time for navel-gazing research, for research on what people might think they would do in the future, what they say they might do. He was more interested in what people actually do, the decisions entrepreneurs actually make that we can observe. So he had a very strong, quantitative, rigorous training, and he valued that in research in the field. And I witnessed at firsthand several occasions where he didn't hold back in questioning work that he didn't see as practically useful. And all of this makes him sound quite intimidating. And he really was anything but intimidating. He was a warm and constructive person, had a great sense of humor. He was skeptical, he was quizzical, maybe a little cynical at times. He was demanding, but he was always very helpful, especially to junior scholars, people coming up. He would want to give a helping hand and to try to help bring people up and to succeed and to become prominent academics themselves, to develop the field.
Thank you very, very much, Simon, for this completely and very detailed presentation to get to know briefly who was this very important person, David Storey. And actually, it's very important also for us to see this tribute paper to highlight and acknowledge the role and the importance of thought leaders of entrepreneurship that build the field of entrepreneurship and allow us to create and continue to study in entrepreneurship field. But also to stress the importance, you were talking about the importance of small business in the economy, which is also the focus of small business economics, to stress the importance and the value of small business and companies that perform with the challenges they may face and constitute the majority of the companies in business. And so it's very important for research, but also to build policies to include them in their growth and their impact in national and global competitiveness. But it's also very important, this paper, for us, as you were saying, regarding to know the historical perspective that you were sharing with us, is to highlight where the film came from, to see also the diversity and the transversal nature, but also you allow to transfer this legacy and this historical evolution of the field to young scholars that we are not aware of this important contribution. And I think what is extremely enriching is to continue to transfer this knowledge and help the next generations to see who were these important people that allow us to create this field and continue to work and expand our knowledge on this in entrepreneurship. And the last comment I would like to raise is the importance of practical-oriented research, but also combining policy implications, but also how the society emerged and how research to this topic is extremely important. So advancing this interview, I would like to ask you how this Tribune article came from, where did it came from, how it came all around. Can you please describe how you, because you have here a very nice community that work on this paper, how you had this idea of this Tribune?
Yes, we were aware early in 2023 that David was terminally ill. He communicated this to several of us, in fact, to all his co-authors, past and present. And a lot of us had it in the back of our minds that we should do something, but it was only really after the Babson conference in Knoxville in June. And Per Davidsson and I were both traveling back to Canada because he had kindly agreed to spend several days at Ivey Business School, which is the part of Western University I work at. And we were hosting him at Ivey. And Per and I were talking on the way back about what we could do. And really the genesis of the tribute article formed there. And then in Knoxville Airport, I'm not sure how many academic papers of any kind have been conceived in Knoxville Airport, but this one was. And as we continue to talk about it over the coming days, we agreed pretty much that we would like to involve people who knew David well, who'd worked with David, and were able to take up themes about what David's work covered that they could authoritatively and reflectively talk about and write about. So what we did is brainstormed half a dozen, maybe 8 core authors who knew him best. And we started a process of a sort of consultative Zoom calls where we'd have meetings. People suggested, well, why don't we bring in a few other people who knew him really well, who have a complementary or different perspective? And in the end, we resolved together, all the authors on this tribute article, to write short pieces, more or less arranged by theme, where we could do justice to the breadth of coverage that David had with the field. I mentioned earlier in understanding the small business sector that David had a very broad overview. There are several prominent themes, and if you read the tribute article, it will give you a good idea of what those themes were. And the idea was each author in the tribute article would focus more or less, or with greater emphasis, on one theme rather than another. So I took on the role of coordinating this and chasing up the authors of the different sections of the piece, circulating these anonymously to other reviewers who were part of the author team. So we managed to get a sort of quality control process in there. And this all took about 6 months to complete. And then by the end of 2023, we were finally ready, after further refinements and revisions, to submit the final piece to Small Business Economics. And that's the piece that you see today.
Thank you very much, Simon. And actually, I was also in Knoxville in the BCRC conference, and now you also share what big scholars discussed during the conference and the product that come around after this discussion. So we're delighted to have these pieces. Can you please also share with our listeners and readers why we should read this paper?
I think you put it very well yourself, Christina, a little earlier, that it's important to understand the origins of our young field and the contributions of one of its early leaders. You know, oftentimes we're all researchers, we research away, we're plowing our narrow furrow, and we're focused tightly on a particular question. And oftentimes we forget that we're actually part of a very broad conversation, which isn't that old. The entrepreneurship field itself, although it has its roots in a more distant past with small business economics and small businesses, it's really a young field. And it's important, I think, to remember where that field originated. And that's one reason why I think it's useful to read this tribute article. And let me give you an example. David's work on policy and evaluating policy anticipated the causal inference revolution, which has swept through economics. It's beginning to set the standard in leading management journals like Management Science and Strategic Management Journal, and which is just about to come and hit entrepreneurship. And David's work gives you an early insight into the practical importance. If we're going to give meaningful and useful policy advice, and this is a major theme in his work, we have to make it more rigorous. We have to get closer to a more experimental or quasi-experimental basis of research designs that allow us to make more causal inference rather than presenting policymakers with some dubious associations, which may or may not be robust in practice. So I think that would be the first strand of an answer to your question, Christina. The second one is, I think you should also read this article because David's work remains important and influential. And let me give you just three examples in the interest of time about why that is. The first one, David really pioneered this notion of discouraged borrowers. So again, an older literature was talking about credit constraints and borrowing constraints. I say an older literature, it's still being researched. And these are people who apply for credit, but who are unsuccessful in receiving it. The bank basically says no. David was interested in another group of borrowers who don't even apply in the first place because they anticipate, correctly or not, that borrowers will not extend credit to them. And we call these discouraged borrowers. And this has intersected nicely with a growing interest and an overdue interest in how we can help disadvantaged entrepreneurs, whether these are women, whether these are minorities, whoever they are, gain greater confidence and engage more with the formal investor and credit market. And so this work really has an ongoing lease of life in current research. A second example would be the regional dimension. Regions were very important to David's story, and the regional persistence of differences in entrepreneurship potential and outcomes is one of those puzzling aspects of macro entrepreneurship research, which we still don't fully understand. And we're still wrestling as a research community with trying to explain why some regions just are so difficult to energize with entrepreneurial zest. And third, I would say another puzzle, physicists struggle with puzzling phenomena like dark matter and dark energy. One of the things that we wrestle with in entrepreneurship is the elusiveness of systematic sources of growth and explaining how some ventures are able to sustain growth over long periods and others, and most others are not, and why growth is such a fragile and difficult thing for us to explain properly. And David, again, had some interesting and important things to say about this, which I think have seeded the discussion today. And those seeds are still waiting in the ground to germinate. And I have no doubt that future researchers are going to pick up on some of those ideas and develop these and perhaps fill in some of those gaps in our understanding. And finally, to answer your question about why should you read this, you mentioned the author team, and there are some really very stimulating and influential thinkers and leaders in the entrepreneurship field who are identifying important and interesting aspects in David's work, which I think are worth reading in their own right. There's just a huge amount of literature out there, as we know, and it's very hard, especially for younger scholars, to get a sense on how do I sort the wheat from the chaff? How do I know what's the more important and less important issues to focus on? Well, you get a little bit of signposting and guidance in this article, because when people like Per Davidsson, when Paul Reynolds, David Audretsch, and so on focus on some particularly interesting and important issues, it's worth paying attention.
Thank you very much, Simon, for sharing this this description and your appreciation for David Storey in this paper. I would like to add another importance, another element why this paper is important to read. And actually, as you were saying, I didn't have the privilege and the honor to meet David Storey, and I think a lot of us haven't had this chance. And actually, thanks to this masterpiece, we have this opportunity to identify, still remember how the field progressed, where we start, what is the basis, and what was the history, but also the challenge in which we should continue to draw and have a contribution. So thanks to this work, we could say that David Storey will remain alive, and the next generation will continue through this this interview and also this paper to have an appreciation. And I was hearing you describe the contribution and the ideas of David Storey, but also how he was as a person, and also he remains alive. And I think it's extremely important to recognize these giants that allow us today to have this trajectory. But also it's extremely important that you raise the values of the field. And I think it's extremely important to stress them and highlight them. First of all, as David was saying, it needs to be meaningful and provide concrete solutions to the society and policymakers to have a direct impact from research to practice, and also to bring together these worlds. But as you say, the second value is to remain rigorous, to identify, to go in other disciplines and also inspire from theories and methods, but also to perform them rigorously. So based on this description, where do you think that David would like to see the future of the field go?
What a great question. You've really caught me unawares there. I think David would very much hope that we would continue to hold policymakers to account. One of his major points was that public money is being wasted egregiously in so many countries by well-meaning, perhaps, bureaucrats and politicians, but wasted nonetheless. And the reason that there's waste is because they don't properly and rigorously evaluate the impacts of their policies. They assume that giving money to small businesses in the form of tax credits or in the form of grants or in some other form through programs, publicly financed programs, is in and of itself necessarily a good thing. And what we know from scholarship, part of which, thanks to David, is that we cannot really make that assumption. That a lot of these interventions might be unproductive for various reasons, which I don't have time to go into. And some of these interventions might actually be counterproductive. And without doing proper, rigorous evaluations, it's impossible to know which is the case. And let me just give you one example of this that David always mentioned. Loan guarantee schemes. These are public guarantees to lenders that if they take on riskier borrowers, entrepreneurial borrowers, than they're usually accustomed to lending to, that the government will underwrite some fraction, 50, 60, 70, 75%, whatever, of the underlying loan. So it's designed to encourage banks to lend to customers that they wouldn't normally lend to. Now, that's a worthy program, and there are lots of examples of these in developed countries. But these tend to be evaluated numerous times. Like in the UK, which is the country that David knew best and where he was located, he referred to ongoing, repeated evaluations of the UK loan guarantee scheme. And that's fine, except for the fact that the amounts of public money that went to the UK LGS was minuscule compared with what was being spent elsewhere on support for the small business and entrepreneurial sector, which was never evaluated. And his call was for government to take a much more, and perhaps this is a little unrealistic, but to take a much more scientific approach, which is to say, we hope that our spending is productive, but rather than hope, let's test it. And if we find that in a public evaluation that's been conducted fairly without wanting to prejudice the results to find a particular outcome, and that we do this in a fair-minded and independent way, and we find that actually the impacts are zero or even negative, then we will say so, and we will change what we do, and we will try to pilot different interventions. And once we have a stronger evidence base, we will put together a program, a policy program designed to press down on the lever that's most impactful. Now, that's what David would want. And I just don't see any chance of that happening. I think the political pressures in practice are too powerful for government to wish to take on something like this. It's too risky for them. There's too much political downside, and they don't see any good headlines if they follow it. And more's the pity, because the benefits from an effective policy set impacting entrepreneurs, the long-term benefits are potentially huge. Who knows? And that's where I'll end. Who knows? Question mark. And that's where we come in. That's our job.
Thank you very, very much for this inspiring conclusion. Also for sharing this masterpiece, these advices. I really enjoyed all this discussion and allowed me to have a better knowledge of how entrepreneurship evolved and the contribution and the work of David Storey. Young scholars, we say that we need to remember that entrepreneurship is a young field, and we need to continue to solidify the basis, the theoretical and practical basis of the field. And we say that young scholars, we're sitting in the shoulder of giants, and we can conclude that David Storey was one of these giants that created the field. So for me, I would like to thank all the group that contribute to have this masterpiece published in Small Business Economics. The paper is in open access, so I encourage all of our readers to download and read this very important paper. And don't forget the history of entrepreneurship, but also PhD scholars and professors to continue to remember the work of the giants in entrepreneurship and continue this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. It's been a pleasure.